Hello, and thank you for attending my dissertation presentation called See You Outside, the Impact of Exercise Amount, Location and Sociability on Mental Health. My name is Ian Ford, and as you can probably tell from that picture of me, outdoor exercise with friends is something that's very important to me and I find very useful for maintaining my mental health. Now, before we move on, I'd really like it if you could just take a quick thought about where your happy place is and where it is you go to in your head when you're feeling anxious or stressed. So we can take 2 seconds just to go to that place. And I've gone there. If you can hold that in your head just for this presentation, we'll be coming back to it. And also, if you're wondering where that picture's taken, I'll share that with you later on in the presentation. So in the introduction, the background is looking at where the issues of mental health. And it's estimated 1 in 6 of us in the last week were affected by poor mental health. And this is a continuous upward trend since 1993. And the UK Treasury estimates this costs around £105 billion across the economy per year. Now, because of this, people are looking at cost-effective ways to improve mental well-being and resilience. And these have included exercise, increased sociability, and venturing outdoors. And this dissertation aims to look at all 3 of those in combination. And there have also been 2 measures of mental health exercise that we'll be focusing on. The first is Wellbeing, which is really a focus on the positive aspects of our mental health. So positive emotions, relationships, meaningful and accomplishments. And the second one is looking at perceived stress. Now, stress can be useful and motivating. In excess, it causes depression, anxiety, tension, and emotional exhaustion. Firstly, looking at the amount of exercise we're doing and the background to this. Exercise has been linked to good health for millennia. Indeed, if you go back to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, he used to write prescriptions for exercise to help good health. And more recently, there's been a consensus that's also beneficial for building and ensuring good mental health. Some research has suggested it's primarily beneficial for low to moderate symptoms around things like kind of anxiety and depression. But there's also been research that has pointed to benefits to more challenging disorders, including PTSD and schizophrenia. And a more recent meta-analysis has looked at improved vitality, sociability, and overall well-being associated with exercising, and also linked to a 49% increase in response to pharmacological treatment. There are risks to exercising. There's a so-called staleness syndrome, where over-exercising creates symptoms that are very similar to clinical depression. And also there's a very big comorbidity for people suffering with anorexia and bulimia, estimated at 44% of the first and 21% of the second, and how a dysfunctional exercise can become part of those conditions. There are also challenges in certain people, particularly with depression, engaging in any exercise at all, and actually trying to get them either out of that bed, out of that slump, or out of the house to engage in the activity can be quite a challenge. There's been a limited research into ideal amounts, but generally when we look at how much is promoted, some people like the NHS and Mind generally recommend 120 to 150 moderate minutes per week. And this is supported also by the American College of Sports Medicine, who has an exercise as medicine initiative which advises 150 minutes per week. Looking at sociability, there's been a more recent focus on the additional impacts of exercising as part of a group or a team compared to individual. And the additional benefits from social exercise have been seen as being reducing tension, increased calmness and energy, lower depression, and the social support that encourages commitment. Very similar to how people often join weight loss groups, or they'll get a friend to give up cigarettes, say, at the same time as them as part of that social boost. Now, the research is limited and has been mixed. For example, we can look at a 2003 study which said there was no impact on sociability, but that was actually a one-time lab experiment, just a one-off. People were given 10 minutes on a bike and then 10 minutes again on another bike, just with someone with them. So it was sort of outside of a standard environment and people weren't given a choice of what sort of exercise they wanted to do. A 2016 study gave very positive research, but it's based on 21,500 participants. But they were all over 65, based in Japan, and it relied on one health question, asking people about what their level of how happy they felt, based again, and how much exercise they'd done. And a 2013 meta-analysis noticed that although there was positives about sociability, the research is very heavily focused on children, adolescents, and the over 65. There are risks to exercising sociably, predominantly with social anxiety. I found one study that identified lower psychological well-being for women unaccustomed to group exercise, and from discussing with these people, that kind of creates a level of self-consciousness and social comparison, which actually makes it less beneficial than exercising alone. And then moving on to looking at exercising in the outdoors, people have also been looking at the benefits of outdoor exercising, and these have included increased energy, lower perceived stress, lower tension, lower fatigue, and increased coping skills. And there's two reasons that have been given for this. One is attention restoration, and this is the concept that when we're inside working, we have one thing we're focusing on, whether it's generally a piece of work with the computer focusing on a piece of work. It's taking a lot of mental energy to do that. But when you're outside in the environment, you've got trees, flowers, woods, rivers, the sea, a plethora of kind of relaxing things to look at, and your brain can't really focus on one. And because it has to focus on so many, it really loses its focus and relaxes. And the second one is evolutionary, the concept that we were kind of brought up in the outdoors, in the environment, and so that is where we feel most comfortable in our lives. Now, research to back up these benefits is mixed as well. We do have single studies that identify benefits from more gentle pursuits such as gardening, up to tree climbing, and even adventure and extreme sports that you'll see as being extremely dangerous, such as solo rope-free climbing or high waterfall kayaking. And although you'd assume that people were doing that purely for adrenaline, when you discuss it with them, the veterans of those sports say that being outdoors in the environment and part of the outside world is something that's very important to them as part of their enjoyment of that sport and what they get out of it. A 2019 meta-analysis, however, identified few significant benefits from all the studies it looked at, but it really blamed the structure of the studies. And so they were generally very small level, they were one-offs, they were very similar to the lab environment before, where you just have one person doing something inside and straight away something outside. And so it wasn't really realistic and the numbers weren't really there. And that maybe better research could prove a link here. And one of those was a 2019 physiological survey that used kind of feedback from saliva, for example, and blood tests of people over an 8-week period to see how the impact on their perceived stress after they've taken exercise outdoors. And it identified a nature pill saying after 20 to 30 minutes, people have a lower perception of stress. However, it was a small number of people that were doing this. It was 35. And also, it took exercise as being sitting down outside would be something it includes, not something to get your blood pressure going. And finally, when we're looking at all these, despite the evidence of the impact of exercise and as a group and outdoors, in 2018, NICE was still estimating that 34% of men and 42% of women are not meeting weekly targets for exercise. Now, very quickly, I'd like to go back, because I think even though we're talking about all this as sort of theoretical, if a happy place that I mentioned a minute ago, about where you're happy, I'm guessing it didn't look anything like this. It wasn't an office, it wasn't a desk, it wasn't that kind of place. I'm thinking a happy place is probably going to be more like this, or this view of Beaumaris, or this view of a canal in the sun. And so I think almost when we think about where we're going to be happy, it's almost a feeling that regardless of those studies, that being outdoors and being in beautiful environments is something that makes us feel happy anyway. And I'm guessing that's where your happy place was. So, okay, introducing the study. So the aim of our study was to determine the impacts of exercise amount, sociability and location on mental well-being and perceived stress through a questionnaire and follow-up interviews. And it used participants to self-report their information. We have 3 hypotheses we were testing. The participants reporting regular exercise will also report high levels of mental well-being and lower perceived stress. The participants reporting high levels of group or team activities will report the highest levels of well-being and lower perceived stress. And participants who report high levels of outdoor activity will report high levels of mental well-being and lower perceived stress. Now, we looked at our participants. From our opportunity sample, we ended up with 361 self-selected adults fully completed the survey, and we randomly invited 10 of them for follow-up interviews. Our age range, we were looking specifically at the main adult range of 18 to 65, and the main age we had was 28.1. There was no limitation on sex, but roughly 70% of them were female. And if you look back at at other studies, females tend to be a high proportion in these, unless they specifically look at kind of groups such as men. And the recruitment was through social media and through Bang University's student participation panel. And our ethics, we adhered to all the BPS and BACP ethical guidelines. It was approved by the Bangor Ethics Committee, and we had a very strong focus on confidentiality, data security, consent, and participant safeguarding. So we're looking at the process with people would access, the participants would access the survey, complete the survey, have a debrief. They could request a follow-up interview. We would then randomly select 10 of them and complete the interview with individually with each of the 10. The design is a 2x2x3 independent measure survey. Independent variables being exercise amount, which we had as a regular, being at least 120 minute or 60-minute vigorous per week, versus occasional, which was less than that. Exercise sociability, which was individual versus group. And exercise location, which is individual versus outdoor. And those independent variables were measured by a novel questionnaire that we created. The dependent variables were well-being and perceived stress score. Now, there were 3 of these. The 2 well-being scores were measured by the WEM-WBS Likert scale and the PERMA Likert scale, and the stress was measured by the perceived stress Likert scale. Each of these had underlying questions as well. So really, we as well as the 3 scores here, we really had kind of 47 pieces of data to analyse. So we ran a t-test on the exercise amount. So this is comparing people who did the moderate for more than 120 or vigorously for over 100 or 60 or an equivalent of the 2. And we can see that for the people that did a lot of exercise compared to the people that did very little exercise, and I will say that we've got a very energetic lot here, only less than 10 out of 360 said they did no exercise. There is definitely an increase in the well-being of around 14% for people that do regular exercise, and a reduction in perceived stress scores of around 17%. Now, if you look on the right, you can see the statistics, the significance of that, and all of them were significant. So looking at that discussion, that supports those previous studies that link regular exercise to positive mental health and reduced stress. And it also tells us that small amounts, because 120 minutes a week is less than 20 minutes a day, that these are sufficient for positive mental health benefits, which supports existing advice that we're getting from like the NHS or NICE. And we also identified, we mentioned the risks earlier, and we had one client feedback to us that one of the issues they had was that they had formerly had an eating disorder, and they found that exercise was something that became quite they became something they had to do, and they became quite dysfunctional for them. So although there's a bit of a risk, although they still do it and enjoy it, they have to admit the fact that there's that risk for them. Moving on to sociability, and once again, this was just people exercise more than half an hour a week. That for those people who exercise in a group for more than 75% of the time, compared to those who exercise alone for more than 75% of the time, you can see that there was definitely an increase in well-being of around 12% and a reduction in stress of around 16% for the people that were exercising predominantly in a group. We were going to look at people participating in team sports as well, but the numbers were too low because of COVID. Indeed, the numbers that we had for group were only 25, but when we ran the numbers, they still managed to be significant. So this extends the previous studies on adolescents, children, and the over 65s to adults between the age of 18 to 64. And we can also agree with those previous exercise that we can see that the social exercise increases mental well-being and reduces stress. As I said, the impacts of teams couldn't be measured, but certainly from an individual versus group perspective, we identified those links. So looking at exercise location. Now, the initial look at this is quite mixed. So this is people who exercise outdoors for more than 75% of the time, compared to people who exercise outdoors for less than or equal to 75% of the time. So those people that were doing this, over 75% of their exercise outdoors, we can see from Wellbeing there's a small increase in one of the measures of around 4.5%. The other one wasn't significant. There was no significant change in the PERMA score, and the perceived stress, there's still been a 10% drop in the perceived stress scores. However, if you remember mentioning earlier, there's 47 underlying questions to these. So what I also did was run t-tests to analyse the impact of these underlying questions, these underlying data against exercise location. And this is the results of the top 5. And you can see that in certain levels, there was a significant change from the benefits of being outdoors to being indoors. So you can see there's a 22% reduction in people's feeling that they had so many difficulties happening that was overwhelming. A 14% reduction in feelings they had issues with coping with everyday life. Anger levels were down 14%, anxiety was down 11%, and they had 9% more energy than people who exercised indoors. You can see on these that these are all significant pieces of data. So as I say, significant reductions to mixed results. And this supports existing research. If we go back to the earlier research, a lot of it was saying that it's a bit inconclusive, particularly around the well-being. But then we look at the physiological surveys done that was definitely saying that pointed towards particularly improvements in stress. And that's pretty much what we've picked up here. But we've also managed, as well as saying stress, we've also managed to identify 5 particular areas not identified before that have seen a particular increase. And that was the reduction in feeling difficulties are piling up, improved coping skills, lower anger, lower anxiety, and increased spare energy. And really those things, if we think earlier to that attention restoration theory, this really fits very well with our attention restoration theory. That because people's coping strategies and the kind of anxiety and anger are reduced as they kind of have this plethora of things to see outside. So we can sort of look at a virtuous circle, really. Outdoor activity leads to lower stress, which leads to improved coping abilities, leads to increased energy, and which leads to more outdoor activities. And potentially this could be a way of looking at how people can start slowly and develop up increased amounts of outdoor activity. Of course, more research will be needed on that. And we also got some of the quotes from the interviews really backed up what we were saying here. For example, one of our interviewees was, "I enjoy nature and getting away from it all. I just enjoy being away from technology and just breathing in the air and the scenery. It's my mental kick. There's nothing nicer than going out on a beautiful day for a walk. And forget worries or helps processing them, and it helps to clear my head." And finally, "Before, when I was just sort of sat in my room staring at my uni work, I was kind of stressed or anxious. Then I came back in from my walk and I felt I got something off my chest, like I calmed down a bit." So this is all really positive, really positive feedback against the hypotheses. But there are limitations. The biggest one being lockdown restrictions impact. A lot of people couldn't do the sports that they wanted, the activities they wanted. They couldn't join the groups or the teams that they wanted to. And so they were doing different activities. And also we see that we reported a lot of increase in negative mental health markers as a part of COVID. Indeed, in looking at our group, the average perceived stress score was actually in the moderate stress range across everyone, which suggests it's higher than the average. So the recommendations are they will repeat the research in a non-COVID environment, but also at some point start focusing on the individual and particularly mental health conditions. So kind of get this nature pill and this outdoor activity, group activity pill, and work out where it actually works better for different kinds of people. So take-home messages. Exercise, particularly with others, has significant impacts on positive mental health and well-being and reductions in stress. Incorporating the outdoors sees significant reductions in stress, in particular improved coping strategies, reductions in feeling overwhelmed, less energy, less anxiety, and more energy. And there's also that potential for that virtuous circle. Now, there are risks, and you need to ensure that you take each client's unique situations into account. For example, people who are finding it difficult to start getting out of bed and doing that exercise, or people with social anxieties, for example, or kind of agoraphobic, for example, for that one. But I think the biggest takeaway from this for today is that place you went to earlier and we came back to in your head, that happy place you're going to. Can you go there? Why not get out there now? Why not when you have some time? Or go to an approximate? Because the evidence we have from all this is it would be really positive for your mental well-being and for your perceived stress levels. Back to my final picture, and I'll end on the picture of me again. And for all those of you wondering, that is actually on the Avon Glaslyn down in Beddgelert in Gwynedd. I will always also a brochure is available, which will give you more information on everything I've spoken about. And we'll also provide references against all the quotes and information provided too. Thank you very much for your time.